Hey everybody, Forrest here from Rocky Mountain School of Photography, and first of all, new video studio. We moved buildings about 6 months ago. We started in July. You guys probably saw our construction videos. The last thing to get done in our new building was the video studio. So we're here, we're set up, it's awesome. What that means for you guys is you can expect more routine YouTube videos. I know we've been pretty kind of on and off the last few months. They should be coming more at a routine once a week pace from now on. What I want to do in today's video is take a look at two super exciting cameras that I've done setup guides on, both of them, but today I want to do a review. The two cameras are, first of all, the Insta360 ONE R, and the second one is the GoPro HERO 9 Black. Again, if you guys already own these cameras, you want to know how to set them up, I've put links in the description to our setup guides. Today is a review and a head-to-head shootout between these two cameras. One quick disclaimer I need to mention before we dive into this video is that Insta360 did send me this camera for the purposes of review. So they're not paying me any money, but I did receive this to make this review. With that said, they were very clear that I did not have to say that Insta360 won all of the categories, and you guys will come to see in this video, GoPro definitely takes it home in a number of the things that we're gonna talk about. Let's go ahead and dive in. So when it comes to the finish and the fit and the build of these cameras, they kind of have taken different approaches. The GoPro HERO 9 is a very just kind of one size fits all camera. It's an action camera, it's a GoPro. If you know what a GoPro is, you kind of know what to expect with this type of camera. But what GoPro has started to do since the HERO 8 and onward is offer mods for their cameras that add in certain features. As an example, for the HERO 8, I have right here the GoPro Media mod. Well, this mod basically gave the GoPro HERO 8 some additional features. Things like an extra microphone and an HDMI port, stuff like that. So these mods can be added to the GoPro to give it additional kind of capabilities. Now, for the GoPro HERO 9, there's a display mod, there's a light mod, there's a media mod again, and those can be really awesome for expanding the capabilities of this camera. So GoPro's gone with a one-size-fits-all approach and then add on mods from there. Insta360 has really taken the opposite approach. They've made their cameras modular themselves. And let me show you guys what I mean. Here's the Insta360 ONE R, and this is in its base, you could say base configuration, but there's not really a base configuration. Let me show you what I mean. What I can do with this camera is actually take the battery off, and you might say, oh cool, you took the battery off. Like, that's not cool in itself. But what is cool is we can actually take these two sides and split them. So let me explain what's going on here. This half of the camera is what's called the control module. It contains the processing power, the memory card, the screen on the back, all of the kind of processing intensive control stuff. This half of the camera is just the camera. It's the sensor, it's the lens, it's all of the picture taking capability. Well, what's really cool is you can actually split the two of them. So the control module is separated from the camera module. And what this allows us to do is basically build a camera for our certain needs. Let me give you guys an example. Here are two different camera modules, both for the Insta360. So these will both attach to that same control module I showed you guys a second ago. This one is their 1-inch sensor mod. It's basically an action camera that has a huge sensor and really good image quality. But what we can do with the same system is use this. This is a 360 lens, which means it has two opposed 180-degree lenses and it captures spherical 360-degree photo or video. What's amazing is we can take either of these modules and attach them to the control module to build a camera for our certain uses. Can take the same battery, pop the same battery on the bottom, and all of a sudden now I have a 360 camera where previously I had a traditional action camera. That right there is modularity. And I honestly was like, oh man, GoPro's so modular. They're offering all these mods now. Well, Insta360 blows the crap out of what GoPro has for modularity. Because for a very small package, I have basically a very high quality large sensor action camera as well as a 360 camera in that much space, and that's super powerful. So to summarize, when it comes to customization, I would definitely give the leg up to Insta360. Not only do they have a huge amount of accessories available for their cameras, but they also, the camera itself is modular. Now with that said, I need to level the playing field a bit for the rest of this review because I'm not going to be swapping these different lenses out for different purposes when I compare and contrast it with the GoPro. So to make things simple, what I'm going to be comparing from now on in this review is the the Insta360 ONE R specifically with this 1-inch sensor mod versus the GoPro Hero 9 Black. Now, with all that said, we need to talk about a couple more general purpose things. And the first is the general usability of the camera. You guys probably noticed when I was pointing this out, the screen on the Insta360 is absolutely tiny. It's booting up right now. You'll see it here in just a second. It's absolutely tiny, which means if you're using this screen to set up settings, you can watch my setup video to see me struggle in real time with this screen. It's kind of unusable, meaning you really need to get your smartphone out and use that for control if you really want to be able to tell what's going on. GoPro, on the other hand, has totally changed that up. The GoPro Hero 9 Black actually has 2 screens, one on the front, one on the back. And the screen on the back is absolutely beautiful. Big, lots of space. I mean, big relatively for a GoPro. Big, lots of room. But on top of that, if you're vlogging, you actually have a front screen as well that you can use to see what you look like. Now, the Insta360, credit where credit is due. This screen, because it's part of the control module, can actually be flipped either direction just by disassembling the camera. So they essentially both actually have front screens. It's just, you gotta pick one on the Insta, whereas the GoPro has both all the time. Anyway, long story short, usability, functioning with the camera if you don't wanna get your phone out, the GoPro takes the cake hands down. So much easier to configure, so much easier to use because the screen is simply larger. Now, with that said, GoPro has been fighting bugs in their software for it seems like since the Hero 6, and that has not changed on the 9. This camera constantly locks up on me. It constantly needs me to pull the battery out. The software is just buggy, and that's not true with the Insta. The Insta software has been rock solid. I've been on shoots. Shoots is a relative term. I've been testing it, right? And it has not failed me once to the point where I've had to disconnect the battery. GoPro seems like, it's like once every 20, 30 minutes, honestly. There's something weird that happens. I need to reset it or I need to pull the battery out. So control-wise, GoPro, hands down winner. Customization-wise, Insta360, winner. And then when it comes to bugs, hopefully GoPro works those out, but right now it still has quite a few. All right, one more thing I want to talk about related to these two cameras and their general kind of comparison, and that is price. The GoPro sells for $400, which gets you exactly what you see here, plus a couple attachments and accessories and things like that. The Insta360 with the 1-inch sensor, let me check my up-to-date pricing information, is $467. So it's about $70 extra for the Insta. We'll see today in the rest of this review whether that happens to be worth it. Here's the advantage though. The Insta has the ability to be purchased with both the 1-inch sensor, which is like the GoPro, and a 360 sensor. And you can get both of these camera attachments plus the camera for, let me see, $595 at the time that I made this video. So for 600 bucks, you get a 1-inch action camera and you get a 360 camera. For $400, you get a GoPro Hero 9. Also, GoPro does make their own 360 camera, but it is $500 on its own, the GoPro Max. So if you need 360, it's probably a better value to go Insta. If you don't need a 360 camera, the GoPro is definitely a better bang for your buck. All right, now I want to take a look at the video and audio quality between the two cameras, and I think it's really important to split this into two distinct categories. I think there are those people out there who are going to use this camera as an action camera, and that's awesome. And I want to address those folks as well as the people who buy this camera as simply a really small, durable, portable camera to do standard video with. So let's talk standard video first. Now, what do I mean by standard video? Well, I mean that I want out of my camera the best, highest resolution video at the best quality, but not necessarily needing to run it at a slower frame rate. And so what I tested with the standard video test is the GoPro at 5K at 30 frames per second, the Insta360 at 5.3K at 30 frames per second, and then everything else set optimally. So white balance set to what the white balance should be. I was shooting flat log on both cameras. Different cameras call that different things, but flat log on both cameras. And then we also were setting the shutter speed to be 1/2 the frame rate, or sorry, 1 over double the frame rate. So everything was set up optimally. I'm gonna go ahead and play that test so you guys can see the difference between the two cameras right now. This is the maximum video quality test, pushing the cameras as hard as we can. Both cameras are at maximum resolution and maximum frame rate, which is 5.3K and 5K, as well as at 30 frames per second. Our shutter speed is locked at 1/60th of a second. Our ISO is locked at 400. We're shooting the flat color profile, so GoPro calls that flat, Insta360 calls that log, and then I've applied a light color grade to both clips in Adobe Premiere. Other than that, you're hearing audio directly out of the camera, no microphones or no anything like that. So from that, you should be able to kind of garner a couple things. For one, I think the Insta360 footage looks way nicer. It's crisper, it's way sharper, it has softer colors, it's more log, it's just better. I think the Insta360 footage when it comes to 5.3K 30 FPS beats the crap out of the GoPro. With that said, the audio on the two cameras was quite different. You guys saw that I flipped the audio partially through that clip, and to me, the audio on the GoPro sounded a little nicer. Now that was internal mics on both cameras, and if I was really using one of these cameras for like real video use, I'd probably get some sort of microphone adapter. They sell little mic adapters, and I'd be using an external mic, something like a Rode Video Micro or a Rode Wireless Go, something external. But with that said, both internal mics did sound good. I just think the GoPro sounded a little bit more full and just a little bit crisper. It almost sounded like the Insta360 was doing some internal processing to the audio, whereas the GoPro was kind of a straight out of the camera, nice, clean, rich sound. So Insta360, I think, wins the traditional normal video test. What I really wanted to do now was put the cameras to the test when it comes to high frame rate, low resolution. So full action, so to speak. And so what we did was we actually set up a splash shot where we dropped a little container of, I don't know whether it was like hairspray or something, into a bucket of water, and we ran that at 120 frames per second at 1080p. Now, the GoPro is actually capable of 1080p 240, and that's one huge advantage of the GoPro, both on paper and in actuality, is that you can shoot double the frame rate. But to keep things equal, you do 120 frames per second on both cameras. Now, we were best case here. We provided enough light that our ISO was as low as possible to kind of mimic a bright sunny day if you were shooting yourself mountain biking down a hill or something like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and show that footage now and then provide a little bit of analysis. Now with this type of shot, I had to be a little bit careful and have the cameras a little bit further away from the subject than I normally would. That's because these cameras do not have autofocus, and I did not want to get the subject too close inside of the close focus distance, because that would have made the subject blurry. On the GoPro, the close focus distance is about 12 inches, and on the Insta360 with the 1-inch sensor, it's about 3 feet. So I was able to keep the subject far enough away to keep it in the depth of field range of the camera. When looking at the footage, it's very clear to me that the GoPro footage is much blurrier than the footage out of the Insta360. In fact, it almost looks like it was shot with a completely different camera. The lenses were clean, everything was set the same, and I just have to think that this is just the way GoPro records footage. Now, what's important to note is at 4K 60 frames per second, the GoPro gets a lot of the sharpness back. So I almost think it's the bitrate of the GoPro being forced to 100 megabits per second, punching all that data through that limits and makes the footage a little bit blurry. So side by side, I think the difference is very, very clear. The Insta360 is much sharper, much crisper, much more defined. The GoPro footage just looks blurry. And this was even made worse at 240 frames per second on the GoPro. The footage was even worse. So my thoughts on this are, I don't really know, because the GoPro is clearly capable of sharp footage. We've seen it with 4K 60 frames per second, we've seen it with 5.3K. It's capable of it, but there's no sharpening going on in the camera here. This is all just straight out of the camera footage. We're seeing it, you know, as it was recorded, and there's a very, very clear difference between the two cameras. Now, one thing I need to mention on the Insta360 is a little bit of anti-aliasing, what it looks like. I don't know if it's actually called anti-aliasing, that's what it's called in the screen display world, but there's some jagged edges on the Insta360, and they're only in some locations. They're not everywhere. Like, there is small detail on the drips of the water that didn't get boxy, but on the sharp edges of the little table that the water's on, we can see some jagged edges. If I zoom in here, and we get really in far. And again, you guys, you're probably not going to ever examine your footage this close. But if we were, we can see that over on the side here with the Insta360, let me move down, we definitely have some jaggedness going on. We can see pixels and see jaggedness. It's not across the entire thing. In the water, things almost look smooth, but on the harder edges, we see those jagged lines. So I don't know if the GoPro is favoring bitrate for blurriness and the Insta360 is favoring bitrate for jagged lines, but there's some strange things that these cameras do in order to achieve these super high frame rates. When we compare these cameras, they all do an adequate job here of capturing this slow motion water. We see detail, we see texture, it looks really cool. So the cameras are doing a great job. I'm definitely nitpicking by zooming in on things, but I do think it's pretty clear that the Insta360 is capturing a much cleaner, much more sharp, high, you could say high resolution, but the resolution's the same, just much more defined image. So where does this leave us for high speed recording? Well, essentially it boils down to this. If you don't need to run footage at 1/5 speed, which is really slow, I highly recommend using 4K at 60 frames per second or 2.7K at 60 frames per second. Both of those resolutions will provide you with still some headroom, 50% or so ability to slow down the footage, and you're gonna retain that nice image sharpness that we've come to expect. Again, like I talked about earlier in this review, if you want to, and you're not gonna slow down the footage, using that 5K or 5.3K at 24 or 30 frames per second is gonna give the best out of these cameras. But if you do need that high speed recording, I probably wouldn't go all the way down to 1080p because these cameras start to break down in some distinctive ways. With that said, it's awesome that the features are there, but again, I do think the Insta360 is doing a better job when it comes to image quality in this test. Next, I want to take a look at the photo quality of these two cameras, and what I wanted to do is really push them to their limits. Those of you guys who don't know, action cameras have very small sensors, and because of those small sensors, it makes it very difficult for these cameras to capture in low light. So I really wanted to push these cameras to their limits in low light and then also in tons of available light situations to try that. Now, I built scenes here to basically test these cameras. These are going to be very indicative of the scenes that you're going to run into using these as actual action cameras, but they were much more controllable for me than actually taking this outside and shooting in a more action environment. I wanted to make things repeatable so that I could run the same tests on both cameras. The first test was under full controlled light. So I actually shot it in here under this same softbox that I captured the video with. And the reason that I did that is there's no other light source in this room, so I can dial the power of that as well as adjust the cameras manually to ensure the best image quality. To show that, here are a couple examples. What I've got here for first of all is a shot from the GoPro. Now this was photographed and then edited in Lightroom to the best of my wife's abilities. I say my wife because Sarah, my wife, is a much better editor than I am, and so I turned it over to her to take care of that. Now you guys can see, here's the GoPro, and my settings are right here, 1/125th of a second, f2.8 ISO 100. Those of you who know something about photography should know that we're basically putting our best foot forward here. We have a lot of available light because we're shooting under a softbox. Our ISO is at the lowest at 100, so we will have the minimum amount of noise for that given ISO, and then also the aperture is always f2.8, so there's not really anything to state there. But you guys can instantly see that Sarah's skin tone is rendered nicely. Even at 100%, things look okay. There is quite a bit of noise in the background, but that's to be expected in a low light situation. We are still stretching the camera here to a little bit of its limits because of how dark the room is. Granted, we are still at ISO 100 to give it its best chance of success. So that's the GoPro. I think it turned out really well, and I can say that out of the camera, the GoPro usually looks better than the Insta does. By the way, both cameras are on manual, as manual as they can get, and we're running both the same settings on both cameras. Now, to turn over to what the Insta created, here's a shot there. Now you'll notice that the Insta is quite a bit more flat and contrastless. It did not have nearly the color or the punch of the GoPro. Both cameras were shooting raw, so there was no difference there, no in-camera processing, but the Insta shoots a flatter raw. It means we need to work harder to make it look better in post-production. So that actually brings up my first point of the photo quality of these two cameras. I think the GoPro produces a better out-of-camera image. Like if you're just taking the images right off the camera, throwing them on the web, even in RAW, the GoPro you're gonna be happier with. But the Insta360 produces a much more editable image in that it is not really had anything done to it in the camera. It's a true raw file. So as a professional, I would much rather have the Insta with the 1-inch sensor than I would have the GoPro. However, if you're looking for the quick answer, the GoPro is going to produce a very good looking image out of the camera. On top of that, you'll notice that the noise level on the Insta is much cleaner. It doesn't have nearly as much color noise as the GoPro does. Let me show you guys a side-by-side comparison here. We'll bring this up in the X to Y view, and you can see that the Insta360 is just a cleaner image. Insta360 on the right, GoPro on the left, but you'll notice Sarah's skin tone looks really nice on the GoPro. And so that's really where that starts to break down as far as photo quality. That's kind of my first point there. Now, moving along, let me go back to the grid view. I really wanted to push these cameras super hard, so we ran them at max ISO. And this is never really something that you want to do. But we did it anyway. So here's the GoPro. This is a very dim lighting condition. This is the GoPro, basically as dark as we can go. We're at ISO 3200, we're at 1/125th of a second, and we're at f2.8. And you'll notice that because we're at ISO 3200, the amount of noise is absolutely insane. Okay, it's crazy how much noise this camera has. We switch over to the Insta, and you'll notice same ISO 3200, same 1/120th of a second, but it's quite a bit cleaner. It doesn't have any of that weird color banding that we see with the GoPro. And you guys, this is really to be expected. A 1-inch sensor like the Insta360 has is over 4 times the area of the GoPro sensor, which means those pixels are larger and it's just able to capture more usable, good information in the shadows and the highlights and all the different areas. Now, this brings up my other important point about using this camera for photo use. The GoPro does not have full manual control. You can pick some shutter speeds, true, but you can't really lock your ISO beyond setting a really vague ISO min and ISO max. The camera will still pick in that range. So you can set your min to 400 and your max to 400 and it'll use 400, but it's kind of a pain. The Insta, you can just say ISO 400. That's the GoPro turning off in the background if you heard that beeping noise. So the Insta has full manual. The GoPro is very limited. And one more limitation of that is that the slowest shutter speed that I could get my GoPro Hero 9 to use in still photo mode was 1/125th of a second. And that's a problem because if you do have a tripod and you're shooting something that's not moving, you can slow that shutter speed way down and let your ISO be lower. So let me give you guys an example about this. And I know this is more advanced, but that's the way that I do reviews, so you guys can bear with me there. Here's one more example. This is the Insta360. At 1/30th of a second, so a little bit slower of a shutter speed, meaning that we run the risk of motion blur. In fact, Sarah has a little bit of motion blur. I could have done better holding firm. But because I can go to a 30th, I can run my ISO at 800 instead of 3200. Same brightness, same exposure, but way less noise. And that's something that's just not possible on the GoPro because we don't have the ability to use a slower shutter speed than 1/125th of a second. Now, I get it, GoPro. Understandable, you want to make sure that if someone is taking a picture, that they're not going to get a blurry picture because of motion blur because they use too slow of a shutter speed. So I understand where you're coming from, but please give us full manual. Insta360 takes photo mode hands down for me in this comparison simply because it gives us more options. And you guys can see, here's a quick comparison back and forth. Here's ISO 3200 at 1/120th, same camera. Here is ISO 800 at 1/30th of a second, and you can see how much less noise there is. The quality is night and day better when we use a lower ISO and a slightly slower shutter speed, assuming that we can handle it. Okay, now switching along, going to plenty of available light, all of a sudden these cameras absolutely crush. You guys can see, here's the GoPro. It's got plenty of light. It's at 1/105th of a second, ISO 200. Sarah looks good. Everything looks nice here. There's lots of sunlight, available light. Everything's nice, right? We switch over to the Insta, and again, things just look good. Same exposure settings. Sarah looks nice. Everything looks crispy. This does bring up again, though, I just want to hammer home. You'll notice, and I think strongly, the out-of-camera RAW out of the GoPro looks better than the out-of-camera Insta. But hands down in editing, I would much rather edit the Insta file than I would edit the GoPro file. So again, it comes down to that same thing. Professionals, I think you guys are really gonna wanna go after the Insta360. I think this camera offers much more headroom for professional use than the GoPro Hero 9 does. However, if you're just an amateur like snapping vacay pics, the GoPro Hero 9 is gonna give you a better photo quality out of the camera. Now, let's talk about HDRs. I snapped a couple quick HDR shots with both cameras. The GoPro does the HDR processing in the camera. The Insta360 does it in the app or in the editor. Here's the GoPro processing. You can see Sarah's face, I think, looks pretty bad, right? It's got a lot of over sharpening. It just looks fake and plastic. We switch over to the Insta, and I think it's still pretty bad, right? None of these have edits. This is straight out of the camera or the editing program. HDR is one of those things that I think use it if you need to, but really I've been impressed with just the plain quality out of these two. Sarah and I redid this shot just for more of a head-to-head comparison, this shot in the studio, and just to show you guys the quick comparison here. Here again, we tried to edit them the same this time, so very similar to the first shot. Insta on the right, GoPro on the left, and you guys can notice that I think the Insta produces a cleaner result. I really do. The GoPro is noisier, the GoPro doesn't have the same look to it, but the GoPro is easier to edit. Okay, that's really what it boils down to. So there's a real good side-to-side GoPro Insta comparison to really show you the difference if you do everything right, full manual settings, what you can expect out of the two cameras. One more thing I need to compare when it comes to photo quality is the consideration of close focus distance. And this is something that's important with video as well. Because the sensor is larger on the Insta360, it's actually going to have a shallower depth of field than the GoPro does. Now, what does that break down to? Well, essentially, the minimum focus distance on this camera is about 3 feet. Well, what that means is that if your subject is closer than 3 feet to the camera, it runs the risk of being blurry. This is not an autofocus lens. It's locked at a certain focus distance at a very, very small aperture. But if you get closer than that 3-foot range, you run the risk of getting a blurry image. The GoPro, because the sensor is smaller, it's actually able to have a closer focusing distance, which is an advantage in a lot of situations. A couple more small little nitpicks about the cameras when it comes to photo. Insta360 only has 4 or 5 white balance presets for Kelvin temperatures. So you can only pick between, I think, 2500, 4000, 5500 and 6500, something like that. There's not very many Kelvin temperature presets. The GoPro has like 10 or 15. Insta360 really needs to add those. I think that would be a really great thing because that's the only thing missing when it comes to manual control on the Insta that the GoPro has over it. The Insta360 does have a dedicated shutter priority, dedicated dedicated shutter priority, dedicated ISO priority, as well as a full manual mode. Whereas the GoPro, you use Pro Tune to kind of set manual, but again, it really gets down to the same thing that I keep saying. Pro users, Insta360, amateur hobbyist users, GoPro. So you guys, I think from all of that, we can really make some real clear, distinct conclusions. I think it really depends on what type of photographer you are or videographer you are to decide which camera you should get. If you're someone who loves modularity, loves cameras that can do a lot of different things, I think the fact that the Insta360 has a 360 mod is really too good to pass up, you could say. It's a really great deal to have both a 360 camera and a normal camera. If on the other hand, you're not really interested in that, I think it really comes down to whether you want best out of camera results or you want to be able to edit things a little bit. The Insta360 does undeniably produce cleaner photo and video in pretty much every test we ran. The audio is a little better on the GoPro, but not enough so that it would really sway me in that direction. So honestly, if you're looking for the best, I think the Insta provides it. It is a little bit more expensive if you're not gonna add the 360 onto the price because you don't have to buy the GoPro Max over there, but I think the quality is there. But you all, that's not really surprising. A 1-inch sensor should beat a smaller sensor. And when Insta360 reached out to ask if I wanted to try this, I jumped at the opportunity. I can't stress how awesome it is to have a large 1-inch sensor in a camera body this small. I hope really that this is something that catches on and GoPro's Hero 10 has a larger sensor. I think this is something that all camera companies need to do. And as technology gets better and better, instead of packing more megapixels into a smaller space and more on paper specs, let's put some bigger sensors in these things and get that low light performance up there. So hopefully I've provided you some insight instead of just confusing you, but that's really what it boils down to. You guys have seen photo, you've seen video, you've heard the audio, you've seen the general things between the two cameras. They're both awesome, and I think they're both really suited perfectly for different types of people. That's my review, you guys. If you got some value out of it, I'd love you to hit that like button. If you guys have a question about this or anything else, check out our community forums. I've linked them down in the description down below. If you guys have a normal question about these cameras, leave them in the comments section. And lastly, hit subscribe up there or down there to stay up to date with our future videos. We put out videos every single week, not always on little cameras. We do Lightroom, we do Photoshop, we do Capture One, we do DSLR stuff, mirrorless stuff, pretty much anything. Thank you all, I really appreciate it. Hope to catch you in a future video, and I wish you the best of luck deciding which camera to buy.